So it's really a treat to come talk with you at Consumers United. I was part of Consumers United in an earlier phase and a representative, and really enjoyed the meetings I went to. I live in the area and I work 5 blocks from here. I'm really familiar with the late afternoon phenomenon in DC meetings, so I don't take it personally that there's some empty seats, but I take your interest very personally. And so I hope that what I get to talk about today flows from the conversations you've been having about value and the role of evidence in determining value, and also coming at it from a patient's perspective. So just a couple of definitions, and I'm only doing this because I wasn't here during the day, so patient organization or patient advocacy organization led by people with a similar condition or diagnosis, and consumer health organization is more what I represent in this mix, a group of people who are not professionals but who care about a particular aspect of health and try to weigh in and influence policy. So why is the perception of conflict of interest important when we talk about consumer and patient health advocacy? It's because we make a difference. We influence policy, and we are presenting ourselves as trying to influence policy from our perspective, our self-defined perspective. For the National Women's Health Network, it says the feminist health organization. For patient organizations, it's the perspective of the people with that condition. But here's a couple of examples from back in the day when I think patient and consumer activism did exactly that, and maybe were sort of alluring to other people who are trying to influence policy. So these examples are from the 70s, 80s, and early 90s. The women standing up to a police officer were speaking out from the audience at a congressional hearing on patients' right to know information about their prescription drugs. They won, we won, those are some of our founders. Patients do have a right, have had a right since the 1975 and 6 and onward from them, to have written information about their prescription drugs. The people lying down by mock-ups of gravestones are AIDS activists. They were trying to get the FDA to change its procedures for reviewing trials of new treatments for life-threatening conditions with no other treatment. They won. FDA changed. And the image I couldn't find, the early National Breast Cancer Coalition marches and rallies and letter writing campaigns that called for a public, meaning a governmental, response and plan to address breast cancer also won. So all 3 of those, pure grassroots, some consumer, some patient, made a difference in policy. That's kind of alluring to industry that makes money from policy. So here are a couple of examples of what consumer and patient advocacy looks like right now. There we go. Crowded slide, but I just want to share 2 examples with you. The one at the bottom, Even the Score, appeared to be an advocacy campaign with a mixture of patient, consumer, and other women's health organizations. It was really a marketing campaign designed by the company that was going to benefit from the policy goal, which was to get the FDA to approve a libido drug for women. And it was successful, sadly, I think wrongly. And I knew at the time that there was money changing hands, that there were financial ties between at least some of the groups, and that made it feel frustrating that the company was using the front of the patient and consumer groups to move its agenda. And then above, that very crowded, lots of logos with just a sentence above it. The sentence is, women's healthcare advocates speak out against U.S. Preventive Service Task Force for finalizing guidelines. That was a pro-mammography screening starting at age 40, regardless of the weight of the evidence. So it was an advocacy effort that was targeting Congress. It included full-page ads in selected newspapers that members of Congress would see, and it has a mixture of patient and consumer organizations that also won. Mammography, breast cancer screening guidelines is the one carve-out of the ACA regulations that require coverage of everything per the U.S. Preventive Health Service Task Force guidelines. So again, in that case, I either knew for a fact or had a strong suspicion that some of these groups had financial support from parts of industry that would benefit from more screening. So have there been, that just doesn't seem right. You know, it just doesn't seem right that industry can hide behind and create the appearance of a consumer, grassroots, patient-led call, push for a policy, and yet really they're funding it. So have there been any efforts to expose this? And yes, there have. Down at the bottom, that really old-looking newsletter article, that's from my organization, and it's publishing the results of a small study that we did, two of our board members did in 1998 and 1999, surveying women's health organizations about their policy about taking corporate money and their policy positions, and got reached out to 80 groups, got responses from 50, and 15 of them acknowledged that they took corporate funding. Next to that is a magazine article done by an investigative journalist who looked at funding for groups to oppose generic conjugated equine estrogen. And then the three titles that you see above are published in medical journals more recently. So these are all great. They do expose and document the ties between patient and consumer health organizations and policy efforts, but they all had some sort of limit. The magazine article is about one particular drug, as is the BMJ article. Our article was our study was just about women's health organizations. Up at the top, that study is just about breast cancer. And then in the middle, those were the largest. That study was done on large patient advocacy organizations. So now we get to Kaiser. This is really exciting. Kaiser has, through support of a large grant from the Arnold Foundation, done a really extensive study and created a database to make the results of their findings publicly available and publicly usable. So how did they do this study? First, they started by creating a definition of patient advocacy organization that allowed them to create a comprehensive list. And their definition is no different than ours. So there wasn't anything special about the definition, but then the searching of what organizations are registered with the government. What organizations can you find in a list of corporate, 501c3 organizations? And they came up with over 1,000, just a little over 1,000 that are, and the caveat to that is with budgets of $500,000 per year or more. So not the really small, scrappy, shoestring organizations, although being with an organization that's at $1 million a year budget, that's pretty small too. But so over 1,000 patient organizations, and then they looked at the federally filed and searchable tax forms for the 20 largest pharmaceutical companies, and if they had one, their company foundation. So that's a big database. It's a great thing that this exists. There are some limits, though. Only 20 pharmaceutical companies were in the scope of the study, and not all of them disclosed. You don't have to disclose as a company who your donations are to, and most did not. Foundations do have to disclose who their donations are to because that's their mission. But as I said, not every company had a foundation. So actually, of the 20 largest, only 14 had information that could be found through the design of this study. We know that left out some important stuff. And we know that they're finding that of the slightly more than 1,000, 594 had documented contributions from pharmaceutical industries in 1 year, in 2015, that if they had been able to search all pharmaceutical companies, there would be many more. And I'll give you one example of that. In the database, if you got on it right now and looked at American Diabetes Association, they are listed as receiving 2.9 million from the companies currently in the database in 2015. In fact, Kaiser's staff followed up with them. In fact, they acknowledge that they received $26.7 million in corporate giving in 2015, from, nearly 10 times as much, and corporate giving meaning from the pharmaceutical industry. So this is wonderful, and it's something we haven't had before, but it is only giving us a limited picture. And it's really important for all of us as patient and consumer health advocates to know that. We should not go around saying nearly half of all patient groups take money from industry. It's more. And yet, look at how much money it is. It's stunning. I've worked in this field for decades. I'm really interested in and upset about conflict of interest. I keep my eye on it, and I was blown away by this amount of money, $116 million in 1 year. And that is twice as much as these same companies spent on lobbying. So, are they using, at least in some part, some of these groups to push policy proposals that they would like to get through their lobbying and other policy efforts? Well, yes. Now, we'll never know exactly how many, but here's one example: pricing. So during the same time period, there was a lot of outcry about high prices, and some of the funded groups stayed silent. American Diabetes Association has been silent on the increase, the really unconscionable, unjustifiable increase in insulin prices. And this one that also mentions EpiPens. So you all know that EpiPens were called out for just disgusting, really, price increases, no justification with new research, new costs, new packaging, just they could do it, they did. And the groups they funded were silent. Two in particular that you find in the database, Allergy and Asthma Network and Food Allergy Research and Education. It's documented in the 2015 database. And another example of that isn't silence, that's actually active opposition to a policy change that could potentially hurt funded organizations that give them funding. So here's an example. I know it's a crowded slide, but Patients for Biologic Safety and Access opposed easier access to biosimilars. And at least 3 of the organizations in that coalition had accepted $9 million altogether from the companies who are most likely to lose market share if their highly profitable biologic was faced with price competition through a biosimilar. And up here, I want to draw your attention to the title of that slide. That is an article that was published on the same day that Kaiser made the database publicly available, and the 3 listed authors are the people who led the research, designed the approach to gathering this data, and really have done us all a great service. I want to show you one more example that I knew about. It doesn't fit the patient advocacy definition, the Society for women's health research, but it's in my women's health world. And it touches on the issue you all have been talking about today about determining value and the role of evidence in determining value. So there's this organization called ICER, the Institute for Cost Effectiveness Research. Their mission is to create objective, evidence-based assessments of the cost effectiveness of new products, and their clients are payors. And to keep from being, having an appearance of conflict of interest themselves, they don't accept funding from industry. So it's meant to be, here's what we think about this new product. It's really great, really, the cost effectiveness is great, or the cost effectiveness is out of whack. And here is the society weighing in just a couple months ago saying, don't decide yet on this new drug. I don't know how to pronounce it, Elagolix maybe, but I know what it is. It's, thank you. It's a drug that could potentially help women with endometriosis, a very painful, important condition, not a lot of effective treatments, particularly medical treatments as opposed to surgical. They're weighing in to say delay, and the drug is made by AbbVie, and AbbVie is on their corporate advisory council. So to me, this is just, it's not even the perception of conflict of interest, it is a conflict of interest. And I want to just lift that one up for you all because of the way it could go directly to value. All right, so what can we do? It kind of seems bad, doesn't it? There's just 20 companies, although the 20 biggest, and they've got $116 million to put on the table in 1 year. They spread that around to 594 groups. 20 of those groups, or 15 of those groups, were getting at least 20% of their annual budget from the companies at that time. In that 1 year, and here we are, groups that are trying to lift the patient voice, and in my case, the consumer voice, for evidence, and to have that come in an unbiased way without the real conflict of interest or perception of conflict of interest. So what can we do? We're up against such enormous amounts of money, but there are things we can do. And support the policies that require comprehensive disclosure. So in the spirit of bipartisanness, which all of us who are part of 501c3 organizations would absolutely respect, I haven't listed the name of this legislation because it doesn't yet have another sponsor to be fully bipartisan, but that is the intent, and it's legislation that's been developed and published by Senator Claire McCaskill, and she's responsible for the Physician Payment Sunshine Act, and this would amend that act. It's called the Patient Advocacy Transparency Act, and it's easily searchable, Senator Claire McCaskill. It would do good. It would do good in the same way that Dollars for Docs database that is now searchable as a result of the Physician Sunshine Act, it would do for this. Because I explained, that Kaiser's database is wonderful and is I think going to make a difference, but we need more. And we need to put the responsibility on the people with the money, the industry, not on a not-for-profit that has to scramble for grants. So that's one thing that we can do. And encouraging health journalists to ask representatives of patient organizations if their organization is supported by the companies that have some relation to the story that the health journalist is covering. So they won't all do it, and the ones who do it won't do it every time, but we've gotten them to do that when they interview medical experts. And again, not everyone, not every journalist, not every time, but it's much more common than it was 5 or 10 years ago. We can do that when we're asked to weigh in, or when we reach out and try to interest a health journalist in a story. And if your organization has a policy of not accepting industry money, say so loud and proud. Say that when you're talking to a health journalist, say it on your website, in your materials, and, if you want to, put your name on this list. This link is to Farmed Out, a group that does a really great job of helping prescribers find ways to get continuing medical education without going to pharma-funded classes and sources. And then there's a coalition that has no staff, no office, no money, but it's a good coalition. The National Women's Health Network is part of it, the Patient-Consumer and Public Health Coalition, and Diana Zuckerman's organization, which some of you may know, is sort of carrying the load of generating letters and looking for places where an independent voice of unfunded, groups could weigh in and have a little more oomph than just one group at a time. And then the stories, I know lots of stories just from, in my work, I hear, whisper, who's getting money, who's not. Tell those stories or pitch them to the reporters who, and the researchers who worked on this great database and the big story for Kaiser News. They're looking for more stories. Pass those stories on. So those are small steps, right, against the 116 million per year. But look at the difference. Look at the changes those people made. Those women just stood up in the audience, and those folks just laid down, with clever signs behind them. And the action plan was all volunteers. Collecting, gobs and gobs of petitions and taking them to a White House that wasn't really interested at first. So those scrappy, little funded efforts made changes that we still feel today. So that's my inspirational ending for the Friday afternoon talk. And here's all my contact info. And I know we're going to have a discussant and then a group discussion. So I'm really looking forward to that part of it and learning and being inspired by what you contribute as well. Thank you.